Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. I am your host. This is the special commentary edition. I won't be talking to a guest, but commenting on current events and controversial subjects. The first one we did last week was on trans matters and trying to define what is a woman anyway, as it was called. Got a huge response, way more views and listens than my normal podcast, and tons of commentary. So I thought I'd do another one and pick another, non-controversial subject like race. Oh boy, have I lost my mind? Well, these are important issues, and we need to address them to the extent that we can through science, reason, rationality, enlightenment, humanism, and so on, which is my perspective. This one is on race matters. We did a whole issue of this. Here it is. I'm unbelievably out of this issue in my office at the moment, but you can order it online. It's a digitized version in which I ask the question, will we ever achieve a post-race world? I, in my 20s, thought by the time I got to my 60s, where I am now, that we would have achieved that, particularly after President Obama. But no, unless you've been living on Mars for the past several years, you know that race still very much matters in America. The question is, why? A century and a half after the Civil War emancipated millions of slaves and outlawed the practice for good, half a century after the Civil Rights Act and corresponding legislation put an end to Jim Crow, and more than a decade after the first black president was elected to the highest office of the nation, why are we now not in a race-blind society? Well, to find out, that's what this issue was about. I solicited articles on critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, anti-racism, and related subjects from over a dozen scholars and writers on the topics. Even though we offered maximal space, minimal editing, and a modest but respectable, for the size of our magazine anyway, an honorarium, I think I offered $1,000, maybe it was $500, whatever, it's decent. Most of the advocates of these ideas either declined or they just ignored me. I just usually got ignored, just no response at all. I went through my regular trade publishing house, who publishes most of my books, Macmillan, and I know people there. They put me in touch with the right publicists and so on. No luck. I received an introduction from the president of Chapman University, where I teach, to a professor there who teaches these subjects, as well as their own dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion, who they just hired last year. None of that panned out. And then all the usual authorities in the field, whose books routinely top the bestseller lists, didn't even respond, even when I went through their book publicists on that. And the anti-racism scholars and the DEI and the Black Lives Matter activists and so on, I couldn't get a response from anybody. For my podcast, which I usually reach like 100,000 people per episode, I was contacted by the publicist of a book by the sociologist Victor Ray is his name. His book is called On Critical Race Theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. It's a, explainer, an intro. It's really an academic book for anybody teaching the subject, which every university and college in America now teaches, and he's the man, right? And the publicist contacted me. So I thought, well, perfect. And since I was just about to start editing this issue, I thought maybe we could do an excerpt. I offered, to give him a full page free ad in the magazine and so on. And the publicist was, excited about this, of course. And then all of a sudden, I got that they didn't want to do it anymore. And just mysteriously, they changed their mind. They decided that they'd had enough media coverage of the book. It wasn't even out yet. Okay. All right. So, make of that what you will. Maybe my magazine and my show is just not big enough for publicists, even though that's not the case with other subjects. Maybe they didn't want to talk to me because maybe I'm not fully on board with it all, or I might be skeptical, or I might ask some critical questions. I just don't know. But, I get a lot of people on the show with whom I don't agree. I get Christians, I get conservatives. I've talked to intelligent design creationists like Stephen Meyer, who is a intelligent design creationist and a Christian. He wrote a book called Return of the God Hypothesis. We talked for almost 3 hours, 2.5 hours on the show. I don't mind talking to people with whom I disagree. I'm generally polite, respectful. I listen. So I don't know what the problem is here, but it's not just me. It's not just, some middle-aged white guy that they don't want to talk to. These people won't talk to John McWhorter or Glenn Lowry either, and they have big followings. And they are black, but they do not toe the line exactly on Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, and DEI. So maybe that's it. I don't know. I got some interesting commentary when I asked Stephen Beckner, one of my close friends and a longtime writer for the magazine, one of the best writers we've ever published. He wrote, for example, Straw Man on a Slippery Slope, the case against postmodernism. So we'd written a lot of critical commentary on postmodernism, so I wanted one that was critical of the critics of postmodernism, which he wrote. Anyway, here was his response when I said, would you like to write an article, just kind of an overview, everything you needed to know for and against critical race theory? Stephen writes back, unfortunately, I don't think I'm the right person to steel man CRT. These days, I regard all of this as an altogether too narrow application of the precepts of postmodernist ideas. The aims of CRT proponents, and what is more broadly termed wokeism, are clearly tactical, not scholarly. The currency of that realm is moral indignation, loyalty testing, virtue policing, scolding, in-group status, preemptive condemnation, and political maneuvering. The only currency I have to offer is logic and rational argument, such as it is. Unfortunately, there is no recognizable exchange rate between these currencies. So that could explain it. But Stephen continues, and I want to read this because it's insightful of what we're talking about here. We have reached a point where the very definition of CRT has become a political hot potato. You have the sympathizers arguing disingenuously that there is no trace of CRT in our culture outside college-level academia. And on the other side, the alarmist detractors claiming equally disingenuously that CRT is a cultural poison that destroys the very idea of Americanism. Meanwhile, CRT, the original one, not the left or right bugaboo versions, is actually a fairly limited, perhaps anticlimactic call for a type of affirmative action within the justice system. Who doesn't want that? All of it feels like a divisive distraction from more thorny and intractable problems. I just don't see this as much of a culture war among the working classes. They've been racially and socially diverse for a long time, out of necessity. Most can't afford to quit a job just because a coworker has some identity that they don't like, for example. It's the elites who are deploying this as a wedge issue in order to draw moral distinctions that enhance their status and justify their economic privilege. Close quote from Stephen. Thank you, Stephen, for that insight. Finally, after I pursued additional leads, we were able to put together an outstanding set of articles for this issue. Here it is again. You can order online at skeptic.com/magazine. Jason Hill's soliloquy to America as the land of opportunity to all people, including people of color and immigrants like himself, and why he doesn't think whites owe anything to blacks. Stephen Bloom's assessment of Jane Elliott's famous blue eyes, brown eyes experiment with her third-grade students, in which she divided them by eye color to teach them about prejudice and what it teaches us about prejudice, race relations, and race sensitivity training programs, which don't work, and why they don't work. Chris Ferguson's analysis of the role of the news media in declining race relations. I mean, if that's all you see on the news is riots and murders and police problems with blacks and so on, of course you're going to think race relations are horrible. Kevin McCaffery, who's co-director of our Skeptic Research Center, did a data-driven look at race and policing. It's not as bad as we're led to believe from the news media. Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's politically neutral historical overview of CRT, critical race theory, albeit mildly critical. Harriet Hall's column on race and medicine. Sadly, we lost Harriet this a few months ago. And an evidence-based article by Mazarin Banaji sorry, I mispronounced that, Susan Fiske and Douglas Massey, making the case that even though most Americans today are far less racist in their social attitudes than they were decades ago, many baked-in social, political, and economic policies continue to operate and account for many of the black-white differences in income, wealth, housing, employment, health outcomes, longevity, and quality of life. That article was a real eye-opener for me. I was skeptical of many of those claims for why there are these black-white differences, but they make a pretty strong case for these. Well, I guess the word we use would be systemic, but it's in a different way, having to do with long-term political and economic trends, not this kind of subconscious racism that supposedly we all harbor. And I'll deal with that in just a few minutes because there's reasons to be skeptical of that research that did not survive the replication crisis. Anyway, this was an eye-opener for me. I'm glad that we were able to do this. It's not the first time we've covered this issue in Skeptic. Before this one on race, which is our redesigned magazine, Pat Lindsay's beautiful cover here on what science says about race. Did it evolve or is it a social construct? I love that cover. We did one on the bell curve. This is when Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's book came out, The Bell Curve, in 1994. So we dedicated an issue to it. Again, there I had a hard time finding anybody to defend the book. I finally got Vince Sarich at UC Berkeley to write a defense of the book, but we published half a dozen critical articles of that. We did another one on race in sports. Why is it certain races do better in some sports but not others? Is it genetic? Is it cultural? So on and so forth. So we've dealt with this subject for a long time. And my very first book, Why People Believe Weird Things, paperback cover here, which was published in 1997. In a chapter on race and racism, I summarized the research to date on the subject at that time, which is still pretty solid research. Quoting Luca Cavalli-Sforza and his colleagues in their magisterial 1,000-page book, which I could not find in my office. We moved the office and I got rid of a lot of my books, and I'm afraid that might have been one of them. It's this massive book called The History and Geography of Human Genes. Quote, from a scientific point of view, the concept of race has failed to obtain any consensus. None is likely given the gradual variation in existence. But we know races when we see them, don't we? It may be objected that the racial stereotypes have a consistency that allows even the layman to classify individuals. But the major stereotypes, all based on skin color, hair color and form, and facial traits, reflect superficial differences that are not confirmed by deeper analysis with more reliable genetic traits, and whose origin dates from recent evolution, mostly under the effect of climate and perhaps sexual selection. Close quote. For example, Australian Aborigines may look more like African blacks than Southeast Asians, but in this case, genetics overrides our perceptual classificatory schemata, because over tens of thousands of years, humans migrated out of Africa, then moved through the Middle and Far East, down Southeast Asia, and into Australia. Furthermore, Cavalli-Sforza and his colleagues observed that individuals within a group vary more than individuals between groups. And it's this between group differences that has everybody agitating about race. Here's the quote from Cavalli-Sforza. There is great genetic variation in all populations, even in small ones. This individual variation has accumulated over very long periods because most polymorphisms observed in humans antedate the separation into continents and perhaps even the origin of the species less than 500,000 years ago. The difference between groups is therefore small when compared with that within the major groups, or even within a single population, close quote. So here was my conclusion that I wrote in Scientific American, in Why People Believe Weird Things, and I still stand by it. Based on this science, since replicated, corroborated, and confirmed, I concluded that checking a box on a form for race, such as Caucasian, Hispanic, African American, Native American, Alaskan Native, or Asian American, is untenable because first, American's not a race. And second, if we go back in time far enough, all humans descended from Africa. On an evolutionary timescale, we are all Africans. since my maternal grandmother was German and my maternal grandfather was Greek, and my fraternal grandparents were from Sweden and Denmark, all confirmed later by 23andMe. I did a 23andMe cheek swab and then wrote one of my Scientific American columns about it. It's really interesting. All confirming what I already knew anyway from my parents and grandparents. And since I'm a member of the species Homo sapiens that originated in Africa, I'm either an other, or if such an amalgam could ever be allowed on such forms, I would tick off the box for African, Greek, German, Swedish, Dane, American, and proud of it. I used to wear this shirt here from Richard Dawkins Foundation. Right? We're all Africans. On the back, it says, the Bible says modern people are the result of incestuous relations Cain and his brothers had with their sisters. Science says we're all descendants of Africans. I believe science. Okay. Well, this is Richard's, anti-religion or science over religion thing. But I always like the shirt because I think it's racially inclusive. I'm not sure I'd wear it anymore. I used to wear that shirt in the early, maybe mid 2000s. I think somebody might accuse me of co-opting, or what's the word, culturally appropriating by claiming I'm black or something. I don't know. Anyway, I probably would not wear that. Let me make a few comments here about the bell curve. This generated a lot of heat because people are interested in the group differences between black and white. Not that Asian Americans score 15 points higher than white Americans, but that white Americans score 15 points higher than black Americans on the IQ. Anyway, that was the figures back when the bell curve was published in the mid-90s. Those gaps have closed up a little bit. But I encourage you to watch my podcast episode, number 227, with Richard Nisbett, who's one of the giants of psychology. And I asked him about this matter, and because I know he's done a lot of research in this area. It's about an hour into the episode. Basically, he cites Eric Durkheim, who's like the world's leading expert on behavior genetics and IQ and so forth, who found that within a particular group, let's say children's IQ in upper middle class families, is about 80% accounted for by genetics. That is, comparing children within upper middle class families, most of their differences can be attributed to genes. But when you compare upper middle class kids to those from low socioeconomic classes, genes don't matter, because in a bad environment, it doesn't matter how good your genes are, intelligence cannot be nurtured. That's an approximation of what Richard Nisbett said. He was speaking, so I just transcribed it so it can read a little bit easier here. The analogy often used is with plant height, the height of plants. If you compare plants of the same species, both growing in rich and nourished environments, they get a lot of water and sunshine, for example, in rich dirt, the difference in their heights will be primarily attributed to their genes. But if you compare plant heights between plants grown in rich and nourished environments to those grown in impoverished environments that have little to no water or sunshine and crappy dirt, the differences are primarily environmental. And the other line of evidence on why it's not genetic, these group differences between black and white are not genetic, or if you want to go in the other direction, between white Americans and Asian Americans, it's not genetic, it's culture, it's environment, is the Flynn effect. So I wrote about the Flynn effect. This is James Flynn's discovery that IQ scores are going up about 3 points every 10 years, which he discovered in the 1930s, now called the Flynn effect. Interestingly, that term was coined by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein in their book, The Bell Curve. That's an astonishing increase of about 30 IQ points over 100 years. I'm reading here from The Moral Arc, where I wrote a section in my chapter on reason. This translates into an improvement of 2 standard deviations of 15 points each, from an average IQ of 100 to a very superior score of 130. IQ scores remain the same, however, as they are regularly normed upward to account for the Flynn effect, which is how Flynn discovered it in the first place. He was looking at the data from the companies that produce these IQ tests. Were it just the case that we're getting better at taking tests, then the scores would have been improved across the board, but that's not what happened. The increases in IQ scores have been almost exclusively in 2 subsets, or subtests that most require abstract reasoning, similarities, and matrices. The subtests of information, arithmetic, and vocabulary have hardly budged at all. Those are the ones you can study for. You can practically memorize vocabulary words, review your geometry and algebra and so on, like what we all do took the GRE to get into grad school. The subtest called similarities asks questions such as, what do dogs and rabbits have in common? If you answer both are mammals, says Flynn, you're thinking like a scientist in classifying organisms by type, which is an abstraction. If you said you use dogs to hunt rabbits, you're thinking concretely, imagining a tangible use for a dog. According to Flynn, for the past century, people have learned to think more abstractly than concretely. Matrices are abstract figures that require determining a pattern and then deducing the missing piece in the pattern. So, for example, here is one of these classic matrices here. So you're supposed to look at the pattern sequence of those, and then down here, pick the one that goes in the missing box up here, right? So you just look at what the pattern is, you deduce the pattern, and find, well, that's number whatever it was, okay? And it's those, and here is the data for the increase in IQ. You can see that the overall IQ has gone up a little over 15 points since 1950, but not down here in the arithmetic vocabulary, but up here in similarities and matrices. What is the explanation for this? Most likely improvement is a function of more years in school, more technologies in society, more technical jobs, and a greater need for people to perform conceptual tasks as our economy has shifted from agrarian and industrial to information-based. Instead of manipulating plows, cows, and machinery, many of us are now manipulating words, numbers, and symbols. Even in science classes, the trend has been shifting away from a rote memorization of facts about nature to reasoning about nature's laws and processes, content, and process. Flynn himself attributes the effect to an accelerating capacity for people to view the world through scientific spectacles. He contrasts the pre-scientific world of his father with the post-scientific world of today through a poignant anecdote about how he and his brother tried to mitigate their father's typical prejudice of his generation through a thought experiment. What if you woke up one morning and discovered that your skin had turned black? Would that make you any less of a human being? And so Flynn and his brother asked their father this question. The senior Flynn shot back, now that's the stupidest thing you've ever said. Who ever heard of a man's skin turning black overnight? The Flynn patriarch was intelligent but not educated, Flynn explained, in attributing the effect to nature, not nurture. To nurture, not nature. The anecdote is symbolic of larger social trends. Each generation is producing not only better abstract reasoners, but better moral reasoners as well. Okay, anyway, that's evidence. None of that is attributed to genes. You can't have genetic changes in populations in just a few decades. It's entirely cultural. Anyway, okay, my motivation in this whole exercise of writing about race, doing this commentary, editing our special issue of Skeptic on it, is that I thought in my lifetime we could achieve, or at least approach, in an asymptotic curve. You know, the curves that go up, they don't quite reach the ceiling, but they keep going up. Is a post-race society in which such superficial characteristics as, quoting Cavalli Sforza, skin color, hair color and form, and facial traits would be considered the least important thing to know about a person. In my 2015 book, The Moral Arc, here it is again. Love that cover they designed for me. I suggest that we had made so much moral progress over the centuries that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, was at last coming true. And so I concluded we are living in the most moral period in our species' history. Why? More people in more places more of the time have more rights, freedoms, liberties, literacy, education, and prosperity than at any time in the past. We have many social and moral problems left to solve, to be sure, and the direction of the arc will hopefully continue upwards long after our epoch, and so we are by no means at the apex, but there is much evidence for progress and many good reasons for optimism. That's how I closed that book. How naive I was. Government, corporate, and academic collection of data on all matters of race has become ubiquitous, driven further along by racial and gender online sensitivity training programs, such as those that my university requires all of us to take. I've had so many of these. These are the dumbest tests you can imagine. Well, most of you have probably had to have. If you're in corporate world, you have to take them as well. Here's my paraphrasing of a sample question. If you overhear someone telling a racially or sexually off-color joke, you should A, repeat the joke to others, B, ignore the incident, C, intervene and explain why telling such jokes is inappropriate, and D, report it to human resources. The answer is always D. Conversations about and coverage of race and race-related incidents are omnipresent in our culture, from social media to mainstream media. I like to tell a story when my wife, Jennifer, moved to the United States from Germany over a decade ago now. She was stunned by the amount of race talk one hears everywhere, as if race is the most pressing of all American issues. CRT, critical race theory literature, is both riding and feeding this cultural momentum, loaded as it is with discussions about racial group differences on everything from income and family wealth to the percentage of black professors in STEM fields. Okay, what percentage of STEM professors have brown eyes, blue eyes, hazel eyes, and green eyes? Pace Jane Elliott's famous experiment. How many brunettes, blondes, and red-headed professors are there in STEM? Who knows? Who cares? Why are these superficial characteristics considered meaningless, except perhaps in Hollywood and dating sites? Whereas equally frivolous features like skin color, hair color, and form, and facial traits are proxies for everything from intelligence and personality to moral worth and social value. The answer is obvious. Race and racism, as manifested in slavery, segregation, lynchings, Jim Crow, profiling, and police brutality, is America's original sin, whereas we have no history of prejudice and bigotry based on eye or hair color, with the possible exception of blonde and ginger jokes. Here I recommend Tim Minchin's song, Prejudice. Just go to YouTube, type in Tim Minchin, M-I-N-C-H-I-N, Prejudice, and the song will come up. It's just genius. So I'll just read just a few of the lyrics here. So he starts off with this kind of dark blue lighting with kind of a subdued tone. In our modern free-spoken society, there is a word that we still hold taboo. A word with a terrible history of being used to abuse, oppress, and subdue. Just 6 seemingly harmless letters arranged in a way that will form a word, with more power than pieces of metal that are forged to make swords. A couple of G's, an R and an E, an I and an N. Just 6 little letters all jumbled together have caused damage that we may never mend. And it's important that we all respect that if these people should happen to choose to reclaim the word as their own, it doesn't mean the rest of us have a right to its use. Anyway, and then he kind of smiles, red lights come up on stage, and the shift in music is much more upbeat, and he sings, only a ginger can call another ginger ginger. So listen to me, if you care for your health, you won't call me a ginger unless you're ginger yourself. Only a ginger can call another ginger ginger. Tim Minchin's a ginger. Anyway, I sometimes I think humor is a good way to deal with these hypersensitive subjects. Anyway, my race-blind utopianism of the 1990s was set back a bit in 2006 when I first encountered the Implicit Association Test, the IAT, that purports to reveal hidden racist attitudes, among other prejudices. The IAT was developed in the 1990s by social psychologist Anthony Greenwald, Mazarin Banaji, who I mentioned earlier, and Brian Nosek, who claim that their instrument reveals that we not only favor white over black, but young over old, thin over fat, straight over gay, able over disabled, and more. I took the test myself, as you can yourself. Just type in IAT and it'll pop up and you can take it. Here's how it works. The race test, for example, first asks you to sort by pressing keys, black and white faces into one of 2 categories, European American and African American. Simple. Next, you're asked to sort a list of words: joy, terrible, love, agony, peace, horrible, wonderful, nasty, so on, into either good or bad. It's also easy to do. Then the words and the black and white faces appear on the screen one at a time for you to sort into either African American, good, or European American, bad. The word joy, for example, would go into the first category, while a white face would go into the second category. This sorting goes noticeably slower. Finally, you're then tasked with sorting the words and faces into the categories European American, good, or African American, bad. Distressingly, I was much quicker to associate words like joy, love, and pleasure with European American, good, than I did with African American, good. The test assessment of me was not heartening. Quote, here's what it said. Your data suggest a strong automatic preference for European American compared to African American. The interpretation is described as automatic preference for European American if you responded faster when European American faces and good words were classified with the same key than when African American faces and good words were classified with the same key. Wow, does this mean I'm a closeted racist? And since most people, including African Americans, score similar to me on the IAT, does this mean we're all racist? The Project Implicit website, which is what this is called at Harvard, suggests that it does. Quote, when we relax our active efforts to be egalitarian, our implicit biases can lead to discriminatory behavior. So it is critical to be mindful of this possibility if we want to avoid prejudice and discrimination. Okay, at the time, I accepted the charge. The IAT, however, Implicit Association Test, did not survive the replication crisis. There are at least 5 problems with the test. 1. Unconscious states of mind are notoriously difficult to discern and require subtle experimental protocols to elicit. 2. Associations between words and categories may simply be measuring familiar cultural or linguistic affiliations. Associating blue and sky faster than blue and donuts does not mean I unconsciously harbor a pastry prejudice. 3. Negative words have more emotional salience than positive words, so the IAT may be tapping into the negativity bias instead of prejudice. 4. IAT researchers have been unable to produce any interventions that can reduce the alleged prejudicial associations. A 2016 meta-analysis by Patrick Forscher and his colleagues, published on the Open Science Framework, examined 426 studies on 72,000 subjects and found, quote, little evidence that changes in implicit bias mediate changes in explicit bias or behavior. In other words, none of this makes any difference. And finally, 5, the IAT does not predict prejudicial behavior. A 2013 meta-analysis by Frederick Oswald and his colleagues in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals in our field, concluded, quote, that the IAT provides little insight into who will discriminate against whom. Here is my conclusion then about all of this in my Scientific American column on it. For centuries, the arc of the moral universe has been bending toward justice as a result of changing people's explicit behaviors and beliefs, not on ferreting out implicit prejudicial witches through the spectral evidence of unconscious associations. Although bias and prejudice still exist, they aren't remotely as bad as a mere half-century ago, much less a half-millennia ago. We ought to acknowledge such progress and put our energies into figuring out what we have been doing right and then do more of it. This is what Carol Tavris wrote in her assessment about the IAT, even more detailed than mine. And so we come to the crux of the matter. Does the IAT really capture unconscious prejudices? Can the test predict whether people will actually behave in a biased or discriminatory way? The evidence is now pretty clear that the answer to both are no answers. When people are asked to predict their responses toward different groups in the IAT, they are highly accurate, regardless of whether they are told that implicit attitudes are true prejudices or culturally learned associations. People's scores aren't reliable either. They might score highly biased one week and get a different result 2 weeks later. And as for the IAT's ability to predict behavior, the ultimate measure of any test's scientific validity, meta-analyses of hundreds of studies on many thousands of people find that the evidence leaking IAT scores with behavior is weak to non-existent. In the final analysis, Carroll continues, I think what is most problematic about the IAT is that it directs people's attention to their supposed unconscious feelings, leaving many puzzled and worried that they might be awful racists without knowing it and without knowing what they're supposed to do about it. It confuses normal cognitive biases with bigotry, and it locates the problem of discrimination in people's unconscious minds, not in the systemic patterns of racism that deserve our far greater attention and search for remedies. Okay, one final thought on this, because maybe we're not even able to ferret out these unconscious biases except through internet searches. So I wrote a column on this in Scientific American, which I'll summarize here. What if, however, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky was right when he observed in his 1864 Notes from the Underground, every man has reminiscences from which he would not tell to everyone but only his friends. He has other matters in his mind which he would not reveal even to his friends, but only to himself, and that in secret. But there are other things which a man is afraid to tell even to himself, and every decent man has a number of such things stored away in his mind. If true, one possible way to measure it is through internet searches. So here I'm leaning on the research from Seth Stevens-Davidovitz, who's been on the show a couple times. Because he worked at Google as a data scientist, and so that is his expertise. He's written a couple books on this subject. That is, to what extent can we ferret out prejudices from what people search for online? Here's what he says in his 2017 book, Everybody Lies. In the pre-digital age, people hid their embarrassing thoughts from other people. In the digital age, they still hide them from other people, but not from the internet, and in particular sites such as Google and Pornhub, which protect their anonymity. Employing big data research tools allows us to finally see what people really want and really do, not what they say they want and say that they do, particularly with pollsters. People may tell pollsters that they're not racist, for example, and polling data do indicate that bigoted attitudes have been in steady decline for decades on such issues as interracial marriage, women's rights, and gay marriage, indicating that conservatives today are more socially liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. Let me repeat that again. Conservatives today are more socially liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. Astonishing. Using the Google Insights tool in analyzing the 2008 presidential election, however, Stevens-Davidovitz concluded that Barack Obama received fewer votes than expected in Democrat strongholds because of still latent racism. Okay, in what follows, I'm going to say the N-word rather than just say N-word, because this is what's printed in these books that I'm reading from. For example, Stevens-Davidovitz found that 20% of searches that included the word nigger also included the word jokes, and that on Obama's first election night, about 1 in 100 Google searches with Obama in them included KKK or niggers. In some states, there were more searches for nigger president than first black president, he reports, and not predominantly from Southern Republican bastions, as one might expect, but from upstate New York, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, industrial Michigan, and rural Illinois. The difference between public polls and private thoughts, Stevens-Davidovitz concludes, helps explain Obama's underperformance in those regions and partially illuminates the surprise election of Donald Trump. This would seem to support the arguments of critical race theorists about systemic racism. But before we conclude that the arc of the moral universe is slouching toward Gomorrah, a Google Trends search for nigger jokes, bitch jokes, and fag jokes between 2004 and 2017, conducted by Steven Pinker and reported in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, showed downward plummeting lines of frequency of searches as a percentage of the peak month indexed to 100 for each search term. From 80% to 10% for racist jokes, from 60% to 18% for sexist jokes, and from 51% to 3% for homophobic jokes. The curve suggests that Americans are not just more abashed about confessing to prejudice than they used to be, they privately don't find it as amusing. Even more optimistically, these declines in prejudice may be an underestimate, given that when Google began keeping track of searches in 2004, most Googlers were urban and young, which are known to be less prejudiced and bigoted than rural and older people, who adopted the search technology years later when the bigoted search lines are in steep decline. Stevens Davidovitz confirms that such intolerant searches are clustered in regions with older and less educated populations, and that compared to national searches, those from retirement neighborhoods are 7 times as likely to include nigger jokes and 30 times as likely to contain fag jokes. Additionally, he found that someone who searches for nigger is also more likely to search for older generation topics such as Social Security and Frank Sinatra. What these data show is that the moral arc may not be bending toward justice as smoothly upward as we would like. But, and I'll conclude here, as members of the greatest generation, born 1900 to 1924, the silent generation, born 1925 to 1945, baby boomers, me, born 1946 to 1964, and Gen Xers, born 1965 to 1981, are displaced by millennials, born 1982 to 1996, and Gen Zers, sometimes iGen, born 1997 to 2012. And as populations continue shifting from rural to urban living, and as post-secondary education levels keep climbing, such prejudices will continue to wane and the moral sphere expand ever toward greater inclusiveness. We're not there yet, but who knows, maybe one day I'll be able to pen an article and maybe a commentary like this titled, "Race Doesn't Matter." It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. It shouldn't anyway, in how we judge other people, but it still does in our culture. So let's continue to push back against that and follow Martin Luther King's dream of judging other people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. All right, thanks for listening. This is Michael Shermer. If you support my work, the podcast, the Skeptic Society, and so forth, please go to skeptic.com/donate and get a tax-free donation there. Appreciate your support. All right, thanks for listening.